With the development of communication technology in the late 20th and early 21st century, the fields of negotiation and mediation were challenged. Can processes be conducted at a distance via technology? Both of these fields went through cycles of resistance and acceptance of technology and of processes at a distance. The negotiation field tended to resist technology at first, only accepting technology several years after it was developed, and then moving on to resist the next technology in line, accepting email, but not yet negotiating via video conferencing, negotiating via video conferencing, but not yet moving on to other technologies such as text messaging, and on in the cycle with resistance to each new technology. The mediation field, on the other hand, rejected technology in a more sweeping manner. While there were some mediators who did accept the notion of conducting processes at a distance via technology, and the field of ODR, online dispute resolution, developed beginning in the mid-1990s, largely the mediation field rejected use of technology, insisted that processes needed to take place within a room. What was the source of this resistance? The most commonly voiced resistance was that negotiation and mediation are essentially human processes, and that online, something of the human touch, the human connection that these processes rely on, is lost and simply cannot manifest in the online environment. Negotiate at a distance online, mediate at a distance online, and you'll be setting yourself up for failure. Of course, along came the COVID-19 era, and with lockdowns and with distancing, all professional activity went online, including negotiation and mediation activity. Any resistance that had existed in the past was swept aside by practicalities, and mediators and negotiators relied on technology just as much as everybody else. And as they kept their practices and their businesses and their activities going through the COVID-19 era, what they discovered is that, generally speaking, mediation and negotiation work online. Hi, I'm Noam Ebner. I'm a professor of negotiation and conflict resolution at Creighton University in Nebraska in the United States. For the past 15 years or so, I've been exploring negotiation and conflict processes taking place online. And my interest in this area is on the human side of things. It's on how people connect and communicate and fight and make up online. And I've recently written a book chapter on the topic of the human touch in online negotiation and mediation. I'll put a link below in the comments. And in this chapter, what I try to do is to take advantage of the situation in which the fundamental question of can you negotiate, can you mediate online, have been laid to rest, and to use this opportunity to reframe the issue. No longer do we need to ask, can we mediate online, but instead we can ask, how can we mediate better online? And specifically with regards to the human touch, we no longer say, you can't bring the human touch online. Instead, we can reframe that question to the question of, how can we bring more human touch into our online negotiation and mediation processes? And perhaps we might even be able to ask ourselves, how can we bring as much human touch as possible into these processes, perhaps to the extent that we might even be able to bring more human touch to these processes somehow. Of course, this is quite a challenge. One reason the human touch issue is so challenging is that it's not really clear what the human touch is at all. In conversations with hundreds of practitioners in mediation, negotiation, and academics as well, when the human touch resistance was voiced, and I would ask, what is this human touch that you're talking about? I received many different answers, and most of them were associative, words that touched one corner or another of this elusive human touch, words such as connection, such as warmth, such as empathy, such as being together, such as joining, such as calming, such as touch, and many, many other words that I've listed in that book chapter I mentioned. But there is no taxonomy of the human touch. There is no definition of the human touch. It's more you know it when you see it kind of thing. And indeed, I recognize that. We all recognize it. We all recognize the human touch when we see it in a room. And that's what humans are wired to do. We're wired for this in-person, in-a-room human interaction. And so when we see the human touch in action in a room, we don't need to pick it apart and ask what's going on. We just recognize it. It's interesting sometimes to take a look and consider, what do we mean by the human touch? And you might want to click pause here and look at this picture with the words human touch in mind and ask yourself, what is going on in this picture from a human touch perspective? We can run that same exercise on a situation that is somewhat less contrived or staged, and in fact in which there is no touch at all. But there is a human interaction, and one can clearly identify elements of the human trust, A, without thinking about it at all, and B, if you look at this image and start asking yourself, what human touch elements are going on in that image? You'd start to pick it apart and recognize it. None of this is so obvious or so natural or so intuitive once we are online. We are not wired for this kind of connection. And our touch mechanisms, whatever we mean by touch, our touch mechanisms are not naturally set up for online touch. Why does online communication challenge human interaction and the human touch quite so much? Well, to understand that, let's introduce a basic piece of communications theory, and that is the notion of media effects, that the medium through which we communicate, or the channel through which we communicate, always affects the message that we are sending. So when we are in a face-to-face setting, that face-to-face channel allows us to communicate in a certain way, and it affects the messages we send, it affects the way we receive messages, it affects the way our counterpart receives messages, and we are sort of used to that setup as humans. Our filters are set for face-to-face interaction, and other communication channels affect the message in different ways. One theory explaining how this works is called media richness theory, which suggests that a medium is rich if it allows for multiple cues to be conveyed between parties, and particularly to be conveyed at the same time. So when we're in a face-to-face setting, and I'm speaking to another person, so I'm broadcasting voice, vocal tone, hand gestures, other nonverbal communication, the actual words I'm speaking, my facial expression, all of these cues are coming across at once and conveying a message. And indeed, we get a lot of that as well in video conferencing. Although you're not seeing right now what might be going on outside of the video box, you're not seeing messages I might be transmitting with my lower body, so there are differences depending on the medium. Email, for example, in which we don't have any of this, and instead we rely more heavily on words than on nonverbal communication, affects the message in a very different way. And indeed, email is considered to be a very lean communication platform. And generally speaking, from a negotiation and a mediation perspective, the more rich a medium is, the more helpful it is for conducting mediation and negotiation processes. From a human touch perspective, these channels not only convey sort of information as to what I'm offering or what I'm willing to receive in the negotiation or in a mediation session, but what they convey are human touch elements. When we talk about what a particular communication channel allows or doesn't allow, what cues does it convey and what cues does it not convey. The tendency both of researchers and of practitioners is to focus on the negative. We look at what a channel denies us, as compared generally to face-to-face communication. And this was particularly noticeable once email started becoming very common, and what was missing was, we don't have tone, we don't have facial expressions, we don't have body languages, I can't ask a quick clarifying question. When video conferencing came along, a lot of that capacity was restored. A lot of those elements found their way back into negotiation and mediation. But on the other hand, once people used it more, they started noticing what the platform doesn't provide or what's missing in the platform. And they started noticing lags, and they started considering what's happening outside of the video box. They started noticing that when we're holding a face-to-face conversation, sometimes we both speak at once, and this is a good way to communicate information, and that doesn't work quite in the same way through video. So we tend to focus on what is missing. Of course, the bottom of the slide is full of things that are missing across both of these media, and some of these things haven't even been explored with regards to mediation and negotiation. Another way to look at communication platforms from a communication perspective, but also from a human touch perspective, is to focus on what does the platform allow us to do. It's a more appreciative inquiry. And when we look at what tools and channels and capacities each communication platform allows us in our communication processes, we might get better at being able to apply them in a more intentional way in order to convey meaning in general, but also our human touch elements. With this brief primer to communications theory and communications theory in practice over communication technology platforms, let's turn to identify some domains of human touch that I've named in this chapter, rather than leaving human touch issues to be a series of associative words, to try and pull them together into certain domains that are clearly human touch domains. And in the chapter and in this talk, I'll discuss 3 of those domains, which are trust, empathy, and social intuition. Let's jump into each one separately, and I'll introduce what each one is about. I'll explain why each one of them is a human touch domain, and also what its importance for negotiation and mediation is, how the online environment affects it, and what we might do in order to work well with that human touch domain in the online environment. Beginning with trust. Trust means a lot of things in a lot of different contexts, and even just in the context of online dispute resolution, I've noted 7 different meanings or contexts of trust in that book chapter, and of all those, I focused on one of those, one particular type of trust, which is interpersonal trust. The interpersonal trust between 2 parties to negotiation, or the interpersonal trust between 2 parties at a mediation, and particularly between each party to a mediation and the mediator. What is interpersonal trust? Well, in the context of negotiation, interpersonal trust is an expectation that if I cooperate, my cooperation will be reciprocated. Basically, if I make myself vulnerable, you won't take that vulnerability and turn around and stab me in the back with it. That's what trust is about. We often focus on outcome in terms of trust. If we sign a contract with the other party, if we feel we can trust them, or we sign a contract with the other to make sure that we can trust them to deliver. But it's really even more important to the process. Every time we share information with our counterpart, we're trusting them not to do us harm with that information that we've shared with them, and essentially made ourselves vulnerable by sharing that information. Every time we ask our counterpart a question, we're asking them to trust us with the answer. As a mediator, when we ask parties, hey, tell me what brought you here, Or when we, in a joint conversation or a private caucus session, we ask them a more pointed question or a more intimate or personal question, and we ask them to entrust us with that information so that we can use it to help them. There's a trust process going on, and that trust process is key to the negotiation or the mediation process. And indeed, trust has been found in negotiation to be the key factor that enables good communication, cooperation, dispute resolution, win-win agreements, and really all of the good stuff that we often talk about when we discuss negotiation. Trust is at the heart of a great many of those. Similarly, in mediation, in addition to all of that, trust is found to be a key factor, the most valuable attribute that a mediator can have is the ability to generate trust in the parties that he or she is working with. So trust is key for both of these processes. Online, trust is challenged. The chapter lists and goes into great detail of a great many challenges that interpersonal trust faces online. It simply doesn't work the same way. We're often dealing with someone we don't know well or don't know at all. We're dealing with someone at a distance. We're dealing through a limited communication platform that allows only certain types of messages, only certain types of cues to filter through. And these all affect the degree of interpersonal trust that forms. And if you like, you can pause the video here and just take a moment to read that over. Or, as I said, can read the chapter and read it all at length. What can we do to give trust a bit more of a fighting chance? How can we enhance interpersonal trust online? Here are some suggestions, and the chapter contains other suggestions. The first is to preempt the issue. Just to say straight out and ahead of time, look, this is a really important conversation we're about to have, and it's going to have important ramifications for both of our lives. And a lot of it depends on trust. But we know that trust doesn't work as well online. It doesn't form as easily, and it's most easily broken, seems to be broken online. Let's just be aware of that and give each other the benefit of the doubt, or the benefit of assuming that the other is well-intended. And just be a little more careful about assuming that the other has broken my trust. Okay? I'll do that for you. I hope you'll do that for me. A second way to enhance interpersonal trust online is to unmask yourself. And by unmasking, I mean that one major set of challenges between negotiators or parties or mediators and parties online is that the distance and the technological interfaces causes parties to appear less immediately and apparently human to each other. We don't get as much a sense of the human behind the positions as we do in the room. And anything you can do in a process to humanize yourself towards the other, to make yourself appear as less as a nameless, faceless inbox on the other side of the world, will enhance the degree of interpersonal trust that is built. So even if you really are faceless in the sense you're dealing via email, you can still share some information about your family, about yourself, about where you are. You can either do this up front and very intentionally and obviously, or you can slip it into emails, and you'll likely see the other party reciprocating this. And that will be your indication that this really is having a reciprocal effect of enhancing trust through the unmasking process. Another way to enhance trust online is simply to resist the channel, sort of the activities and mindsets that channels drive us into. People tend to jump straight to business online, both in email and on video, and they skip over relationship building. And part of that relationship building facilitates trust. Remember all of your face-to-face negotiation skills, tools, and priorities, and try to figure out ways to bring them to bear online, rather than letting the platform kind of dictate what you do or what you don't do. And finally, remember, we often talk about negotiating via email, or negotiating via video conferencing, or negotiating via a particular platform. But in real life, what we do in our relationships is we mix media. Some of our interactions with a certain person are face-to-face, but we can also pick up the phone and call them, or send them a text message, or send them an email. And we do this for different purposes and achieve different types of results. And you might want to remember that you can do that in negotiations as well, or in your relationships with mediation parties as well. After you've had a video conversation, for example, you might send a quick text to clarify a point, or just to say you hope everything is okay, or whatever it is, and to use that mix of media intentionally in order to build relationship and particularly trust. A second human touch domain is empathy. And empathy is as complex as trust is, and just like trust, it has elements that are cognitive elements and emotional elements. Empathy, like trust, it's from the heart and it's from the mind. And in empathy, two of its components that demonstrate this is that one component of empathy is the notion of perspective taking, my ability to see things from the other's point of view. And another component is empathic concern, which is different, which is my ability to identify and accurately identify the other's emotional state, the other's feelings, which is quite separate from their point of view. Why is empathy so important in negotiation and in mediation? Well, first of all, as negotiators and mediators, we know that it's at the foundation of so much of what we do. When we talk about connection, about being together, those are generally words that are associative words that express a sense of empathy. And when empathy is enhanced in a room, we have that sense of connection, we have good communication, our information sharing increases, our information processing increases, because we're able to see things from both points of view, and we have cognitive and emotional data in the room. And it's that kind of ability to see things in a multifaceted manner that allows us to be creative and to expand the pie. And empathy also contributes to trust, and all of these human touch domains all contribute to each other. And with regards to empathy, just as with regards to trust, once we're online, we're playing on an uphill playing field. It's very challenging. The online environment challenges the way empathy forms. It tends to diminish our sort of natural, intuitive, empathic response to another. Not just the response that we voice, but the internal response, the feeling of empathy. For example, the fact that I don't see someone via in an email negotiation means that my own brain is not generating empathy responses, which are a part of humans interacting while they can see each other. Okay, and since it's not developing those empathy responses, the other party isn't seeing those empathy responses. Not only that, but even as I do form empathy responses, they're less accurate. Research has shown that generally speaking, my ability to correctly identify what my counterpart is feeling, or to accurately be able to put myself in their shoes, is diminished online. Certainly, with all the challenges to communication online, my ability to express empathy and to tell the other party, here's how I see things from your point of view, tell me if I'm right, my ability to be accurate in that expression of perspective taking, or my ability to accurately nail the emotion that the other person is feeling, to express that emotion, is diminished. And finally, even to the extent that I do express empathy perfectly accurately or not perfectly accurately, it's not enough to express empathy. Empathy is effective in human interaction only if it's recognized and received on the other side, so by my counterpart in negotiation. And some of the challenges to interpersonal communication via communications technology limit my counterpart's reception of the empathic messages that I might be sending them to. So empathy is significantly challenged online. What can we do? In this context, we might separate, just to get used to looking at things across different media, because there's not one solution to any of these that cuts across everything. So one recommendation in video conferencing is to eliminate self-gaze. When we communicate via video conferencing and I can see myself on the screen, that's a very unnatural condition in human communication. And quite naturally, humans tend to look at themselves. And of course, when we look at ourselves, when we look at our own image, our own video box on the screen, we're concerned with self, and we're less concerned with others. So naturally, we are less engaged empathically with the other. So just setting your video settings to turn off self-view is helpful. So you're only looking at a picture of your counterpart. Set that picture of your counterpart, move it on your screen to be closer to the video camera, so that while you're looking at the picture of your counterpart will occasionally have the sense that you're looking into their eyes. Even though this is artificial, meeting your counterpart's eyes, or your counterpart having the sense that you've met their eyes, triggers an empathy reception response. They feel your empathy towards them. You can also do this more intentionally when you really and honestly want to display empathy, simply by looking directly into the camera. And you're doing it intentionally and in an artificial manner, because there's nothing natural about gazing into the eye of a camera while you're speaking. But my suggestion is to do this, it's to do it benevolently when you really want to give your counterpart a shot of empathy. Do this intentionally, even though it's counterintuitive and unnatural to you. And finally, there's something in video communication, as well as in email communication, of course, that tends to diminish our expressions of empathy or our use of empathy, as we don't do things that we would do very naturally in a room to display active listening, to the various ways that we have to show empathy. And there seems to be less empathic expression. And online, we need more rather than less. So don't let the channel drive your behavior in this regard. The same goes for email. And in email, it's particularly challenging because you can't even make artificial eye contact. You can't see each other. But what you can do is you can demonstrate listening. Listening, of course, is an empathy tool. And active listening that we're used to doing in negotiation, which is showing the other that you're listening to them, you're engaged with them, you want to hear them, you understand what they're saying. It's something that's trickier to do over email, but you can do it. If you write back to your counterpart, hey, I read what you wrote me last night, and I went over it again to make sure that I got all the details correct. And I particularly noticed that and then you copy and paste a certain sentence or passage from what they wrote, and you share how you feel about them, or you tell them, I understand that from your point of view, what you're saying is X. And I understand your concern. It seems that you're concerned that you might not get the delivery in time, and you're going to have to, and your boss will ask you what's wrong with the delivery, and you're worried about what this is going to do for your relationship with your own boss. In a descriptive way, you've used different active listening, empathy building tools, even in the limited channel provided by email. So these are just examples of ways that we can intentionally enhance empathy in an online interaction. The final human touch domain is less familiar. This is a domain that I've developed together with Andrea Schneider in a book chapter that we wrote in 2017. We call the area social intuition. And social intuition is an array of connection-forming elements. It's the nuts and bolts of the interactional elements that cause the sense of flow, of connection, that are largely intangible. They're largely intuitive. And what we've suggested in that chapter was that while negotiation is, of course, often focused on the deal, right? The elements, my positions, my interests, my alternative, the different options that we have between us, the interaction itself and is also affected by a lot of other issues that we talk about far less. For example, do we like each other? Is my counterpart feeling comfortable in this interaction, or is something in the interaction making them feel defensive? Or as a mediator, do I sense that parties are comfortable with one another? Do I sense, is there something external that might be bothering them? You know, are they hungry, thirsty? Is the room too hot? Have I failed to provide something that they would need to be comfortable? Is there any way that I could get closer to them? I mean, just the word, can I get closer to them, as a human touch sort of notion. But these things are not spelled out either in the negotiation literature, negotiation training, exactly what are all these intuitive connections. And we've drawn a great many elements together from areas that are covered in some of the literature, areas like emotional intelligence, social intelligence, nonverbal communication, elements of liking, of power, of rapport, of relationship building. And we've formulated them into three key elements for use as social intuition. And we focus on the notion of self, other, and bridging. And self is knowing myself and my tendencies in a particular area. Other is recognizing the other's tendencies and preferences in a particular area, and also recognizing how my own will likely affect them. And then bridging is about finding a way to connect between the two of us using my tendencies and preferences and capacities, their tendencies, preferences, and capacities in a way that constructively builds an intuitive, unspoken perhaps, but very felt connection between us. This might sound a little mysterious, but it'll be explained simply by demonstrating it. Particularly as we come to the online and we notice, oh wait, all of those are missing. So one element of social intuition is physical proximity. And of course, when we engage online, there is no physical proximity. But think about physical proximity in a negotiation room. Remember negotiation rooms? And think about how you as a negotiator, how you feel when somebody is close to you, somebody's too close to you, someone's too far away from you. And think about how sometimes you use change of distance intentionally or intuitively, even just by leaning in or leaning out. So physical proximity, A, matters, and B, think about it in terms of self. You have preferences, you have tendencies, you have comfort zones. The other does as well. And I think we all know as negotiators and as mediators that we use physical proximity as a means to build a bridge or remove an obstacle from in our relationship with the other person. So sometimes we'll lean in closer, sometimes we'll stand closer or actually be closer, and sometimes we'll either distance ourselves or give the other more space in order to enhance comfort. Sort of combine that with the notion of physical contact, another element of social intuition, and those two connected, how they form sort of joint bridges when they're used well. And now consider how we're missing those online. In video conference, all of these elements of social intuition are diminished to some extent. At best, we get a bit of a facsimile of them. We can lean in and lean out, and I certainly recommend using this. By the way, most video conferencers I've observed don't tend to lean in, lean out. We stay very rigid in our position. Like we found the square and our place in the square, and we stay there. But we can change the sense of physical proximity through leaning in or through leaning out intentionally. Our capacity for observing or using body language is different. We only have the box. We don't have we can't use our whole bodies. Eye contact is artificial. So many elements of social intuition are diminished in video conferencing and simply squashed in email. There is no physical proximity or body language or vocal tone or physical contact, of course, in email. Of course, what does exist, both in video conferencing and in email, from the array of elements of social intuition, are humor and metaphors, analogies. And I think that we all know that there's something about online interaction that too often cause these either to fall flat or to backfire compared to when we use them in a room. So even though they technically work in the online environment, there's something about online communication and different kinds of online communication that, let's say, diminish their effectiveness and sometimes downright cause us a lot of trouble. So what can we do to enhance? First of all, it's just recognizing, like, you cannot read the other as you generally have been able to in a room. And that will help you to avoid attribution. It'll help you to avoid inferring negative intent on your counterpart's side. If you just sort of let yourself off the hook. Yeah, I mean, sure, they're looking in a certain direction, or they're doing a certain thing, or they used a certain word. I can't get them as much as I did. Just ask a question, or wait patiently, or look for other signs, but don't jump to judgment. Similarly, recognize that the other's capacity to read you, and therefore your ability to convey to the other party, is also diminished. So if you're the type of mediator who relies on their warmth, on your charm, on your wit, on some aura you project, whatever words that you'd use, but you know it when you do it, it doesn't convey online in the way it does in the room. It doesn't mean it doesn't convey at all. It just means it doesn't convey in the same way. Generally, it'll be somewhat diminished, and you're going to have to be mindful and intentional about reinforcing it if you rely on that. Finally, we can resurrect some of these missing elements mainly in a verbal way. So by painting a verbal picture, either in the words we use in an email or in the words we convey in a video conference, we can sometimes sort of evoke or bring into the room these elements of social intuition that are not really there in our online platform. So if we say, well, I mean, this is, after hearing that offer, this is a moment which I'd like to reach out and shake your hand. And if you do that on video conference, so you're changing social, you're changing physical proximity. You're not going to reach touch, of course, but there's something about that sense of shaking a hand, of being willing to do that, that might sort of trigger that same handshake response in the other. And if you can't do that, if you're in email, you can use those words. You might even say, this is even more of a high five moment than it is a handshake moment. And you can write that as well in an email. By painting a verbal picture, you can bring some of that back into the process. But all in all, social intuition online is a very challenging thing. And we're going to have to do some work and some research and some practice in figuring out what the best ways to bring this element of the human touch back into the negotiation and mediation process are. And having said that, the same is true for other human touch domains. These three human touch domains of trust, empathy, and social intuition are examples of areas of human touch and how they affect negotiation and mediation. They are by no means the only domains in which human touch is important and meaningful and essential and sometimes key in negotiation and mediation, and we should be looking into them. And examples that came to my mind as I was writing the chapter is the topic of respect as a human touch issue, paying respect, or a human's sense of dignity and the way that is either recognized and contributed to or diminished in online interactions. The notion of genuineness. How do we bring our authentic self to a negotiation or to a mediation setting and convey that sense of genuineness to our counterpart, to our parties? That's a key human touch issue in these processes, and we need to figure out how to do it online. The topic of rapport, sort of as distinct from the topic of trust or the topic of communication. That sense of in-syncness, of togetheriness, of it's elusive. It's one of those things, you know it when you see it. And when it works in a room, you're absolutely aware of rapport. How can we do that better online? In person negotiation and mediation processes, we have rituals. We have multiple rituals. Just the way we greet someone and escort them to a table, or the way or how we meet people in a meeting room or at a coffee shop, and what is sort of the niceties and also the human interactions that we go through before we actually jump into the process that we're here. At the end of the process, we have rituals, the signing ritual, the handshake ritual, the escorting to the door. We have rituals in the process itself, such as taking a break, such as in mediation, such as if we choose to have separate sessions with parties, or parties choose to have separate sessions with us, how are those initiated? How is the other escorted out? How does that play out online in the same sort of ritual way that we have built into our in-person processes? We still need to figure all that out. And of course, beyond all of this, there are probably many other human touch domains that I haven't named, but that I hope you'll be thinking about, notice in your work, and I hope that that you will name them. And if you do name them, then please feel free to write them in the chat below this, or to email me and say, hey, I've noticed that this seems to me to be a domain. I have some ideas. I hope, and then I'll get thinking on it as well. So there's a lot of recognition and naming and ideating to be done on our way to understanding the human touch in negotiation and mediation. If you're interested in learning more about this, so one thing you can do is to read the chapter, which goes into far greater detail about all of these elements and more. And that's the first item up there at the top of the list, and below that, and you can pause the screen here if it'll be helpful and read over it and see whether one of those other book chapters or articles might interest you in your own exploration of negotiating and mediating online, and particularly in bringing the human touch to bear. I hope this interested you. I'm glad you stayed with me throughout it. If you've reached this far, I appreciate the attention. I would really appreciate any comments you have in the chat, or you can reach me via email. This is the point at which my children have instructed me time and again that this is where you say, if you've liked the video, like the video. And if you'd like to learn more about negotiation, mediation, negotiation and mediation processes conducted online dispute resolution, and other related topics, feel free to subscribe to my channel, and then you'll receive updates on other videos that I put up from time to time. Thanks for being with me.